Hello and welcome. Today we are taking a word that gets thrown around all the time, the bourgeoisie, and we're putting it under a scientific microscope. We're going to move past these vague ideas of just the rich to really dig into a precise definition of the capitalist class. You know, what it is, where it came from, and what its role is in the world today.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll get a real scientific definition. Then we'll trace its history, from its rise to its fall. After that, we'll look at how it rules the world today through this system of imperialism, check out the mechanisms of that rule, and finally, we'll deliver history's verdict.
So first things first, to really get a handle on the bourgeoisie, you have to look past the fancy cars and the expensive clothes. The sources we're digging into today make a powerful case that it's not about lifestyle, it's not about what you buy, it's about something way more fundamental. Your relationship to how our society actually produces everything.
To ground this in reality, just look at this staggering figure from Equatorial Guinea, a country with one of the highest GDPs per capita in Africa, and yet, the vast majority of people there are living in extreme poverty. Now, this isn't just some tragic accident, it's actually a massive clue.
Right, so how is that even possible? This question is at the very heart of what we're looking at. And the answer, according to the source material, is found in a scientific understanding of what a social class really is. It shows us that this huge inequality isn't a glitch in the system, it's actually a core feature of its design.
So this brings us to a really key concept, the means of production. The easiest way to think about this is like it's society's collective toolbox. It's everything we use, from a simple plot of land to a super complex data center, to create all the wealth and the stuff that we all need to survive.
And this is where it all clicks into place. The bourgeoisie, quite simply, is the class that owns that entire collective toolbox. On the other side, you have the proletariat, the working class, who own none of it. So the only way they can survive is to sell the only thing they have, their ability to work, their time, their energy, their skills, to the class that owns everything else.
Okay, so that raises a huge question. Where does profit actually come from? Well, the sources argue it's not some magic trick of the market. It comes from something called surplus value. Think of it like this. A worker might create enough value to cover their own wages in, say, the first couple of hours of their workday. But they don't go home then. The value they create for the rest of the day is surplus. It's unpaid labor, and that is the source of all profit.
And what's wild is that this isn't just some vague concept. It's a real mathematical relationship. This quote, which comes from an analysis of a retail empire, shows that you can actually measure the rate of exploitation. It's the ratio between the part of the day you're working for yourself and the part of the day you're working for the boss.
Okay, so we've nailed down the core economic relationship. Now let's look at how this class actually developed through history. Because, the bourgeoisie wasn't always just a parasitic class of owners. The sources trace this dramatic historical arc, arguing that this class once played an absolutely revolutionary role in human history before it turned into the exact opposite.
And this slide just perfectly captures that whole journey. I mean, on the one hand, you have this powerhouse class that rose up, shattered feudalism, overthrew kings, built the modern nation-state, and unleashed incredible productive power. But according to the analysis, that progressive role is long gone. Today, they're seen as a fetter, a brake holding back human development.
And this conclusion, from a deep dive into post-colonial Mali, is just a devastating summary of this shift. It argues that, in our modern era, the ruling classes in former colonies are actually incapable of building genuinely independent, thriving nations. Their nationalist projects, the sources say, are basically doomed from the start.
The source material gives us a pretty grim catalog of these failures. You look at Ghana, you look at Mali, you look at Western Sahara, and the story is basically the same. The local national bourgeoisie ends up being too weak, too dependent on foreign money, and frankly, too scared of its own working class to see any real development through. They always, inevitably, end up capitulating to the dominant global powers.
So this pattern of failure doesn't happen in a vacuum. It leads us right to the structure of the modern world system. It's a system defined by imperialism, the total economic and political domination of the entire planet by just a handful of powerful capitalist states and their financial institutions.
And what's so interesting here is that the analysis gives a specific name to these ruling classes in dominated countries. They're called a comprador bourgeoisie. They aren't independent nation builders. They're basically local managers or overseers. They administer the plunder of their own country,
and in exchange they get a junior share of the profits.
This table on the Gnassingbé dynasty in Togo is a crystal clear step-by-step example of how this plays out. I mean, just look at the pattern here. At every single critical moment, the assassination of the first president, the military coups, the rigged elections, French imperialism stepped in to install and maintain its preferred local managers. It's a strategy to ensure the country's wealth keeps flowing in the right direction.
And this is not some one-off case. This timeline from Liberia shows the exact same pattern of domination, this time by the United States, just wearing different masks over the years. You go from direct corporate rule, creating a literal Firestone Republic, to a US-backed military dictator, and now to a UN protectorate basically run by NGOs and international banks. The forms change, but the core principle of external control remains the same.
So, we've seen this global structure, but how does a system like this, which the sources describe as being in a permanent state of crisis, a death agony, actually manage to hold itself together? What are the consequences of its deepest contradictions?
Well, here it is. This is the central problem, the knot at the heart of the system that it just cannot untie. Think about it. We have a completely globalized economy. The phone in your hand has parts and labor from dozens of countries. Production is social, but ownership is private, and control is carved up between rival nations. This creates an absolutely explosive, permanent tension.
And that tension, according to our sources, explodes in three truly horrific ways. 1. Endless war, as rival nations fight for control of the world's resources and markets. 2. A turn towards dictatorship and fascism, to crush opposition from the working class at home. And 3. Total paralysis in the face of ecological collapse, because a system based on private profit and national competition is literally incapable of solving a global crisis like climate change.
And these aren't just theories. Our source dossier lays out the brutal reality. The war in Yemen, a war of annihilation fueled by these rivalries. Sisi's military regime in Egypt, a giant prison for any form of dissent. The deliberate murder of the RLC for cotton profits. These are the real-world symptoms of a social order in decay.
So, let's pull all of these threads together. After tracing its origins, its mechanism of rule, its decay, and its modern-day reality, what is the final verdict on the bourgeoisie? What does history have to say?
The conclusion presented in the sources is completely unambiguous. The bourgeoisie has gone from being a revolutionary force to a purely parasitic one. It can no longer develop human society. Its continued rule now only guarantees destruction through war and crisis. It has become the single biggest obstacle to solving the most urgent problems that we face as a species. And this is so critical because it gets to the why behind this entire analysis. It argues that massive historical changes don't happen because of good or bad ideas in people's heads. They happen when the way we produce things, our technology, our global supply chains, comes into direct conflict with the way society is owned and organized. That is the engine of history.
And so we end on this fundamental question. If the sources are right, and the ruling class is structurally incapable of solving global problems like war, climate change, and poverty, what does that imply for the future of all of us? The analysis we've explored today suggests that this is a contradiction that, one way or another, has to be resolved.